Masechet Kiddushin, Daf Tet Vav. We just saw a machloket between a Tana Kama and Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar said that the laws of an Eved Ivri who sells himself are equivalent to laws of an Eved Ivri who is sold by a Bet Din. However, Tana Kama said there are several differences between them. For example, someone who sells himself does not pierce his ear, cannot renew. Whereas if the Bet Din sells him, then he can do that. So we're going to look for the source for this. My Tama de Tana Kama de Amar Mocher Asmo eno nirsa. How come someone who sells himself cannot get his ear pierced and remain as a slave for longer? We're bringing in a pasuk from Shemot, Parashat Mishpatim, which the Gemara says also is about someone being sold in a Bet Din, just like Devarim also is about an Eved that's sold in a Bet Din. And in that pasuk in Shemot, it says that the owner will pierce his ear with an awl. And so this word, at ozno, his ear, meaning his ear, that's a limiting word, and not the ear of someone who sells himself into slavery. That's it. Once his time is up, that whatever time they agreed to when he sold himself, that's it. He does not have the option to renew. Okay, ve'idach. Now, to be Elazar, he said that the two types of slaves are equivalent. So what is he going to do with that pasuk? Ozno. Hahi legezera shavahu da'ata. Detanya Rabbi Eliezer Omer, minayin l'rsi'a shi be'ozen yamanit, nemar kan ozen, nemar lalan ozen, mar lalan yamin, af kan yamin. So he's going to use that word for a gezerah shava. As the Braita teaches, how do you know that when you pierce the ear of a slave that you do the right one? Because also regarding a misorah, where you have to use the right ear, put blood on it to purify him. There it says the right ear, and over here it says the word ear. So just like regarding the misorah, it's the right ear. So too here we use the right ear. So he's using a pasuk for something else. Now v'idach Tana Kama, where is he going to learn this law that it has to be the right ear? Imken lema kira ozen, my ozno. He could learn two things from this word, because thus the word ozen by itself, I learned the right ear. Ozno, his ear, means only the one who's sold by a Bet Din and not the one who sells himself. Ve'idach, Rabbi Elazar, what are you going to do with the extra letter of ozno? Haumi ba'ale ozno velo ozna. He says that's to teach that only a male slave can pierce his ear and remain longer. A female slave does not have that option of renewing. Ve'idach, and now Tana Kama, where is he going to learn that law? Nafkala mi ve'im yomar ha'eved velo ama. He can learn that from a different phrase. If the slave says, I like my master, I want to stay. It says here, Eved, it doesn't say Amma. Therefore, only a male slave can renew, and an Amma cannot renew. V'idach, Rabbi Elazar, what are you going to do with that pasuk? From that, he learns from there that the male slave can only renew while he's still a slave. Now, let's say it's for 6 years, and so near the end of the 6th year, he has to say, I want to renew. If it already passed, and he was already freed, he can't come back even a day later after he was freed, come back and say, oh, I'd like you to pierce my ear, I want to stay. Once he's freed, that's it. He lost the option to renew. Good. V'idach Tana Kama. Doesn't he agree with this law? Where is he going to learn it from? Me'ayvid. Ha'ayvid nafka. Oh, the pasuk says, Im yomad ha'ayvid has an extra ha'yidi'ah. So he learns that law from the extra he. V'idach, and Rabbi Elazar, what are you going to do with that extra he? Ayibid. Ha'ayibid, la darish. He does not learn anything from the extra he. He just says that's just part of the word. You have to say, im yomad ha'ayibid. You can't just say, im yomad ayibid. And therefore he doesn't learn anything new from that. And there you go. That's the source of the machloket between Tana Kama and Rabbi Elazar about whether someone who sells himself as a slave can renew by piercing his ear. Next, Tana Kama said, someone who sells himself does not get a severance package. This is curious, just logically. Why should that be? If he sold himself, shouldn't he deserve one? Someone who's sold by a bet din, because, by force, so he stole something or whatever. So, and that person should get a severance package. A possible explanation is that the Torah says we are abadim to Hashem only, right? He took us out of Egypt. So really, you're not allowed to sell yourself into slavery willingly. And so that person who sells himself willingly, Tanakama could say, he doesn't deserve a severance package. Whereas the one who was sold by a court by force, he didn't want to be a slave, but he was forced to, so then maybe that person is actually better and deserves a severance package. Okay, whatever the reason, we want to know the source. The pasuk regarding someone sold by a bet din in Devarim says, surely give him a severance package to him, lo. So we learn from that word law that specific, it's a limiting word only to the one sold by a bet din and not to the slave that sells himself. Ve'idach, Rabbi Elazar, what is he going to do with that word law? Hahumi ba'aleh lo ve'lo liyorshav. That he teaches that this severance package goes to the slave when he goes free, any slave, according to the Elazar, and not to his heirs. So, for example, let's say the slave, he's at the end of his term and he's going free, but then he dies before the master gets a chance to give him the severance. So the heirs of the slave can come and say, "Well, pay us the severance." Could they say that? The answer is no. It only goes to him, law, and it doesn't go to the heirs. Now we ask, Yorshav, my law. Wait, why not? Sachir kariyera chamana. Ma sachir peulato liyorshav, avhai peulato liyorshav. Eved Ivri is called a sachir, like a hired worker. And what if a hired worker, let's say he did a day of work, and then he dropped dead at the end of the day before he got paid? The heirs can go and collect the wages for that day. Since the Eved Ivri is similar to a hired worker, so the severance should be able to go to the heirs. So law can't be limiting that, because in fact the heirs do get it. Ela lo velo leba'al chobo. Rather, Rabbi Elazar could say that the money goes to the severance goes only to the slave and not to someone who is owed money by the slave, right? If you have someone who wants to come collect the debt, he can't, instead of going to the slave says, I have no money on me. Can the person who is owed money, can the creditor go to the owner and say, hey, that severance that you're going to give the slave, give it to me because he owes money? No, there's no obligation to give the severance to the creditor. The severance only goes to the slave himself. Now, why might you think that you could do that? Can you have the person in the middle, skip the middleman? If A owes B money and B owes C money, right? Can C just go straight to A instead of going through B? Well, there is an opinion that says you can in general. Rabbi Natan says, in general, if you have A that is requesting money from B, and B is requesting money from C, then A could skip the middleman, go to C, and say, hey, I want you to pay me. How do you know that? Because it says you will give to whoever is guilty. Whoever needs to pay, you have to give it to him. And so, even though A has to pay B, but B has to pay C, so you know what? Just pay the one who is, just go to the one who needs to pay, all straight there, because he has to pay B, so you may as well just give it to C directly. So the Rabbi Natan says, in general, you can do that. But for the word law says, that's for a general loan or someone that owes money. But in the case of severance, although that's something that the owner has to give, the creditor cannot do this, come and say, hey, just give it straight to me because he owes me money. No, this severance is special to the slave. He gets it directly. Now, ata lo la'apuke. So the word law comes to exclude Rabbi Natan in this case. Fine, that's what Rabbi Elazar could do with it. Ve'idach, but now Tanakama, he used law already as a limiting word to say that this applies only to someone that's sold by Bet Din. So how is he going to learn this law? Tanakama could say, in general, I don't agree with Rabbi Natan. Just because A owes B and B owes C doesn't mean C can go all the way back to A, right? A could say, leave me alone. I owe B. I have nothing to do with you. And so since you can't do that chain collection in general, so there's no need to exclude it in this particular case. So they both agree that for the wages, the creditor cannot go straight to the owner to collect. Now, the next difference between Tanakama and Rabbi Elazar, Tanakama says that someone who sells himself into slavery, his master cannot force the slave to have children with a shifcha kena'anit that he also owns. But someone who sells himself, someone who's sold by Bet Din, the master can force that, and then he owns those children. Im adonav yiten lo isha lo velo lemocher atzmo. So Tanakama could say, I'm going back to Shemot, which is also about someone sold by a Bet Din. It says if his master should give him a wife, law, a limiting word, that this law only applies to someone who is sold by Bet Din and not someone who sells himself. V'idach law ba'al kol chor. Rabbi Elazar, what's he going to do with that word law? That is to teach me that even against his will, this slave, well, according to Rabbi Elazar, both types of slaves this applies to. Both types of slaves, the master can say, I want you to go get me children with the shivcha kana'anit, and even if he says, no, I don't want to, he can force him, whip him, whatever, force him to do so. Ve'idach, now, Tanakama, how is he going to learn this law of ba'al kol chor? Mi ke Mishne Sechar Sachir Nafka. From the phrase in Devarim, which is also about someone who was sold by a Bet Din, it says he worked double. Tanya, Ki Mishne Sechar Sachir Abadecha, Sachir Eno Oved Ela Bayom. Aved Ivri, Oved Ben Bayom or Ben Baylaila. Where is the double work here? Well, a regular worker works during the day, but not at night. Whereas in Aved Ivri, he has to work for the master both in the day and in the night. Now, what kind of work is he doing at night? שעבד עברי עובד בין ביום בין בלילה, הלא כבר נאמר כי טוב לא עמך, עמך במאכל, עמך במשתה. Can you think that the Eved Ivri is actually doing physical labor both in the day and the night? The Pasuk says it should be good for him with you, that he eats with you, he drinks with you, he has to have a standard of living the same. Whatever you're eating for dinner, he eats for dinner also. So that means he should work, or he could work during the day. You can't work him 24/7, right? That's not living well with you. He has to live a regular life. It's okay. He can work all day. Everybody works all day, but he can't go and do field work at night. That's not reasonable. Rather, what's the work that he's doing at night? That the master can force him to sleep with the shivcha kana'anit at night, and that way, if he wants children, to produce children that will continue to be slaves for him. So that's where Tanakama learns this law that a master can force his slave that was sold by Bet Din to be with the shivcha kana'anit at night. Ve'idach, Rabbi Elazar, what's he going to do with this derivation? No, even from this derivation, I might have thought that's only if he agrees to, right? That if he agrees, then the slave will work in the day and the night. And Pasuk is saying, don't feel bad that you're letting him go free after 6 years. He worked for you day and night. Probably he did, right? Assuming that he was willing to do that work at night and bear children for him. But it doesn't mean necessarily that you force him to. Maybe if he doesn't want to, you cannot force him to. So that's why, according to Rabbi Elazar, you still need the word law to teach me ba'al korcho. So that's what he does with this pasuk. So now we understand the derivation according to both opinions. Ela man tana de la yalif sachar sachir. Now we're going to the previous stuff when we mentioned this gezerah shava of sachir. Sachir, it says it in Vayikra and in Devarim, once in the context of someone who sells himself, and the other one in the context of someone who's sold by a bet din. And since it says the same word in both, so we applied the laws of one to the other. And we mentioned that there is a Tana who does not use this gezerah shava, and we suggested that maybe that is the Tana Kama of the Braita we were just mentioning. That would be Elazar, who says the law is applied to both the same. He does make this gezerah shava, and Tana Kama does not. But then we said, no, in fact, Tana Kama learns all these laws from other places. So now we're back to the drawing board. Who could be the Tana who does not use this gezerah shava? And we answer, Hai Tanahu, the Tanya, Veshav el mishpachto, Amar bi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Ba'ameh hakatu medaber, Ibo mocher atzmo, Hare kevar amur. We're discussing these two Pesukim here in Vayikra, which is about a slave who sells himself. It says, Ad shenat yovel yavod imach, he will work until the yovel year. And next Pasuk it says, and then he will leave you, and veshav el mishpachto, and return to his family. So there's a doubling here that we're going to try to figure out, what does this mean? What does it apply to? So who is the Tana that does not use a gezerah shava? It would be the following, the Tana of this Baraita to be Eliezer ben Yaakov, who asks, what is this pasuk talking about? The second pasuk, Veshav el mishpachto. If it's talking about someone who sold himself into slavery, that was already mentioned in the previous pasuk, Ad shenat yovel. So, ibn irsa, if someone who sold himself, that let's say for 6 years, and then yovel comes in the middle, he goes free even before the 6 years. That I already learned. If the pasuk is talking about nirsa, that he continued, he renewed by piercing his ear, that also is already mentioned. We're going to explain where it's mentioned in just a second. It's from the word ish. We'll see that. But anyway, we already know that. Shetayim v'shalosh shanim lifnei hayovel, shayovel mosi'o. Rather, it's talking about someone who was sold by a bet din, and it's within his 6 years. They just sold him 2 or 3 years before the yovel, and then the yovel comes, that person also. That's what we do with that extra pasuk, v'shav el mishpachto. Now, that's the Braita. V'isa kadatach yalif sachir sachir, lamali, nelef sachir sachir. If you did have if this Tana had the gezerah shava, why would he need this derivation from this extra pasuk? He could have said, well, I know from someone who sells himself, that's the original context here, so I could figure out from the gezerah shava that someone who's sold by a court also. From the fact that they don't use sachir, but rather from the extra pasuk, that means that this Tana does not use this gezerah shava, right? Not necessarily. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Le'olam yalif sachir, B'yisterich sakadatech amina. Maybe in fact he does have this gezerah shava, but nevertheless, I might have thought that the following logic would override it. Because mocher atzmo hu de la avad isura, someone who sold himself, he did not do a violation, meaning he didn't steal. He's just poor, and so he says, "Listen, I need to sell myself because I'm poor." So that person deserves to have the right to get out during yovel. But someone who stole, didn't pay, and then comes to bet din and said you have to, or injured and can't pay, and he's bet din has to sell him, that's because he did a transgression. So he does not deserve to leave in the yovel. Maybe he gets a penalty that he has to stay through yovel. That's what I would have thought. Even if I have sachir, I would have thought maybe it does not apply to this case. Kama shmalan, and that's why even this Tana, even if he has sachir, would still need the pasuk v'shav el mishpachto. So therefore, this Tana is not necessarily the one who does not use the gezerah shava. Now we have to go back and analyze, because in the Baraita I mentioned, Nirsa is already mentioned. Nirsa is already taught that he goes out in the Yovel. Where was that? Amar Mor, Ibn Nisa Rekvar Amor, Maihi, Tetanya, Veshabtem, Ish el Achuzato, Veish el Mishpachto, Vegomer. Bameh HaKatum Medaber, Ibn Mocher Atzmo, Hare Kevar Amor. Ibn Churu Betin, Hare Kevar Amor. Ha'en HaKatum Medaber, Ela Ben Nisa, Shetayim Veshalosh Shanim Lifnei HaYovel, Shayovel Mosi'ah. So here, we're going to explain it through another Braita that quotes another pasuk earlier in the same perek. As this pasuk, "V'kidashtem et shenat hamishim shana k'lemderod la'aretz l'chol yoshebeha yovel hi tieh lachem v'shabtem ish el achuzato." That refers to the land going back to its original owner, and ve'ish el mishpachto tashubu, and everyone going back to his family, referring to slaves. It says the word ish here, which is important. So now we ask, what is this pasuk referring to? If it's talking about someone who sells him slave, that's already mentioned, pasuk 40 later on. If it's one sold by a betin, we also saw that in pasuk 41. Rather, this must be talking about someone who already was got his ears pierced 2 or 3 years before the Yovel. That person, a nirsa, also goes free in the Yovel. Now we want to explain this. My mashma. How do you see from this pasuk that it's talking about a nirsa? Amar Rava bar Shela, Amar Kera Ish. Ezu davar shenoheg beish ve'eno noheg be'isha, have omer resi'ah. Since it says the word ish, an extra word, what is that adding? What is a law of slavery that applies to a male but not a female? That is being a nirsa. Only a male can extend his stay by piercing his ear, not a woman. And therefore, this is talking about a nirsa. Good. Now, why do we need all these pesukim? Why can't we learn one from the other? We need the law. We need to learn the law regarding someone who's sold by a betin and also someone nirsa. If you only had someone that the betin sold, so I might think that he goes free because he was just sold. His term was not up yet, so he deserves to go free. He didn't ask to be renewed. But nirsa, who already finished his 6 years and now he decided to stay as a permanent slave, I would say, well, he should be penalized, right? You're not supposed to stay as a slave. You wanted to stay. You renewed on your own, therefore you stay forever, and Yovel doesn't free you. I might have thought that, so that's why I needed I need to be told regarding nirsa. If I only had nirsa, I might think mishum davad le'shesh. Okay, but he at least completed his 6, and now he wants to stay longer. So maybe that it breaks the extended period for him. But he already did the minimum 6. But someone who's the betin sold him, he didn't even do the minimum 6, and so therefore maybe the Yovel does not break it. He is punished. He stole something. He has to pay. So he has to do all 6 right through Yovel. I might have thought that, and that's why I need the other pasuk to teach me that someone is sold by betin sericha. That's why I need both. I also need this law is treated in Vayikra, where it says you will return to your land, and it says in Shemot that he will be a slave forever. What do you mean slave forever? Right? We see from here that actually means Yovel. So why does it say forever? If I only had the pasuk in Shemot forever, I might say it's a permanent slave. So that's why I needed to say Vishabtem, that they go back. Katav rachamana v'shavtem. V'katav rachamana v'shavtem. If I only had the pasuk that says he goes back, havamina hanemi lehecha dela avad shesh, aval hecha de avad shesh lo yehe sofo chamur mitechilato. Ma techilato shesh af sofo name shesh. Kamash malan leolamo shel yovel. And if I only had the pasuk that says v'shavtem, that he goes back in the year of the yovel, I might have thought that when does he nirsa go back in the year? When does a nirsa go back in the yovel? Only when he has not yet reached 6 additional years. In other words, he did the original 6, he became a nirsa, and now yovel comes in year 3, so that person will go free. But someone who already did the original 6 and then another 6 as a nirsa, I might have thought that's it. That's the maximum for a nirsa. In other words, I might have thought that when you become nirsa, so then you get an additional 6, and then you go free, right? So why? Because his second stage should not be more stringent than the first stage. The first stage, when it becomes initially an Eved Ivri, that's only 6 years. So in the nirsa, maybe that just means that you get an additional 6 years. It shouldn't be worse, right? The elective renewal shouldn't be more years than the original slavery. And so I might have thought that Veshavtem therefore applies only within the 6 years, but once 6 years comes for a nirsa, then they go free no matter what. That's why it has to say le'olam, that a nirsa will remain a slave forever, even after 6 years. But even though that olam means the age of that yovel, right? The entire period of that yovel, not really forever, since it says vishavtem. So by bringing the two words together, instead of treating it as a contradiction within the Torah, we see that each word is balancing each other out, that the nirsa is more than 6 years, that's the le'olam part, but not really for his whole life. It's only until the yovel, that's the vishavtem, that's what it teaches. Okay, elaman tana delay yalif sachir. Back to the drawing board. We need another candidate for someone who does not have the gezerah shava of sachir, and we recommend Rabbihi. Maybe it's Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the Tanya. V'im lo yigael be'ele, Rabbi Omer be'ele hu nigal, ve'en nigal be'shesh. We're talking about an Eved Ivri that's owned by a non-Jew, and the Pesukim say regarding that person, this is towards the end of Vayikra 25, that after he sold, one of his family has the right to redeem him. They should. Either Dodo or Ben Dodo, his uncle, his cousin, they can redeem him, or any other of his family from his flesh should redeem him. Or if he can redeem himself, or if he can get some money, then he'll be able to redeem himself, and you calculate the number of years and pay pro rata. Then the pasuk back down here says, "Ve'im lo yigael be'ele." This the word be'ele is going to be key. If he cannot be redeemed in these ways with the family, then ve'yasa b'shnat hayovel, then he goes free during the yovel. So Rabbi says that a Eved Ivri owned by a non-Jew can be redeemed by that in those ways, himself or his family, but not 6 years. If he's owned by a non-Jew, the law of 6 years only applies to an Eved Ivri owned by a Jew, but an Eved Ivri owned by a non-Jew does not go free after 6 years. Now, why do I v'im lo yigael be'ele, right? So it's saying specifically that the only way for him to get out of slavery is be'ele, by being redeemed. Now, why do I need this derasha? Sheyachol v'halo dinhu u'ma mi she'eno nigal be'ele nigal b'shesh ze shenigal be'ele eno din shenigal b'shesh. If a regular Eved Ivri owned by a Jew is not redeemed by his family, and yet after 6 years he goes free, so this Eved Ivri is owned by a non-Jew, where his family does redeem him, he can be redeemed by his family, all the more so. He's more easily redeemed, all the more so. He should go free in the 6. After 6 years. That's what I would have thought. Talmud Omar be'ele hu nigal ve'en nigal b'shesh. Therefore, the B teaches this word be'ele says not so, that an Eved Ivri owned by a non-Jew can only go free by being redeemed from his family or himself, but not automatically after 6 years. Now, that's what the B taught. Here's our analysis. V'sakadatech yalif sachir amay ka'amar uma mi she'eno nigal be'ele nelef sachir. If the B did have this gezerah shava sachir, it says the word sachir in this context also in this section regarding an Eved Ivri owned by a non-Jew. In addition, it says it regarding an Eved Ivri who sells himself to a Jew, or that a Bet Din sells to a Jew. So it actually says it in all three contexts. So if you have this derasha, then why would you say someone who is not redeemed in those ways? If you have the gezerah shava, then you would say that even an Eved Ivri owned by a Jew can be redeemed by family. So since he doesn't say that, it means he doesn't have this gezerah shava of sachir. So that's why we propose that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is the one that does not have this gezerah shava. However, now we reject it. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Le'olam yalif sachir sachir, v'shan nehachad amar kera yigalenu leze v'lo la'acher. Maybe, in fact, Rabbi does have the gezerah shava of sachir sachir, and therefore he would learn this derivation, but here it says they will redeem him, yigalenu, those extra letters teach that you can only redeem this type of Eved who is owned by a non-Jew through redemption of family, and not the others. So you could have Sachir Sachir, but you have another Dirasha that overrides it. So in the end, we actually don't have a definite author of the person who says that we don't learn the Gezerah Shava. Once we brought up Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, his opinion, now we're going to analyze those who disagree with him. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said that an Eved Ivri owned by a non-Jew is the only one that can be redeemed by family, but otherwise stays past 6 years. Uman Tana de Palig Ale de Rabbi. Who disagrees with him? Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, Rabbi Akiva de Tanya. Lo yigal el be'ele. Rabbi Yosef HaGalili omer be'ele l'shichrur, bishar kol adam l'shi'abud. Rabbi Akiva omer be'ele l'shi'abud, bishar kol adam l'shichrur. Rabbi Yosef Galili and Rabbi Akiva use this word be'ele for a completely different purpose, as the Braita teaches. Lo yiga be'ele, that if they are not redeemed by one of those the family members. So then what happens? Is there a difference between being redeemed by a family member versus being redeemed by someone not related? So there is a difference, but which way does it go? Rabbi Yosef Galili says be'ele, meaning these, the family members, if they redeem a slave that's owned by a non-Jew, then that slave goes free. But if it's a non-family member who redeems them, then they're redeeming them for further slavery. Basically, they're buying them, so it's better that they be a slave under a Jew rather than under a non-Jew. So that's what he does with the word be'ele. Rabbi Akiva, however, says the opposite way. Be'ele, these family members, if they redeem someone, then that Eved Ivri from a non-Jew, then they remain a slave within that family. Whereas if it's a not related Jew that redeems them, then they go free. Okay, how will they each explain this be'ele? How does he understand this pasuk? Amar kera, im lo yigael be'ele, ela be'acher, v'yasa b'shnat hayovel. If he is not redeemed with a family member, but rather with a not family member, then he remains a slave, and then he will go free in the Yovel. But it's a family member, he goes free right away, and then you don't need Yovel. Okay, clear enough. Rabbi Akiva has to add in a kind of extra word here. It says, if he is not redeemed, but rather he is redeemed with a family member, then he remains a slave and he goes free in the Yovel. But if he's redeemed by a not family member, then he goes free right away. Okay. Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, midi ela be'ele ketiv. So Rabbi Yosef HaGalili says, you're adding in the word ela before be'ele. That's not a grammatically smooth way of reading it. V'im lo yigael be'ele v'yasa b'shnat hayovel. No, the natural place to stop is v'im lo yigael be'ele. So if the family member does not redeem him, if the family did redeem him, they would go free. If the family member does not redeem him, but he is redeemed by a non-family member, then he will then he will remain a slave and go free. Okay, so since Rabbi Akiva's reading is really not smooth at all, we're going to suggest a different basis of their machloket. O dodo o ben dodo yigalenu ze geulat kerubim, o esiga yado ze geulat asmo, v'nigal zo geulat acherim. Rather, it's based on this basis of this pasuk, which we also explain each phrase. If it's his uncle or his cousin, this is regarding family members. And then it says, or if he gets money himself, that's if he redeems himself. V'nigal, the last word we say, is referring to a non-relative redeeming him. This is not really mentioned in the pasuk explicitly, but we're using that extra word to talk about redemption by a non-family member. Now, what's the relationship between these two phrases? Rabbi Yosef Galili sabar mikra nidrash lefanav shadeh geulat kerubim a geulat asmo. Rabbi Yosef says, take the middle one, which is about redeeming himself. If he redeems himself, certainly he goes free, and connect that with the one before, such that a relative redeeming him is the same as because him redeeming himself. Just like if he redeems himself, he goes free, so too if a relative redeems him, he goes free. So we connect the first two phrases together and separate from the last phrase. Rabbi Akiva sabar mikra nidrash laharav shadeh geulat acharim geulat asmo ma geulat asmo leshikrur af geulat acharim leshikrur. Rabbi Akiva says no, we should connect the middle one with the one that comes after, and put it with the redemption by foreigners. Just like someone who redeems himself goes free, someone who's redeemed by a non-relative also goes free. Those second two are together, separated from the first one. If it's a relative, they remain a slave. We ask, Ihachi be'ele lamali. Okay, if you're going to use it from this pasuk, then what do you need that extra word be'ele for? Ila be'ele havamina mikra nidrash ben lefanav ben le'acharav v'akol leshikrur. Because if I didn't have be'ele as a limiting word, I might have thought that you should read this pasuk to be all three together, that the middle one about redeeming himself should apply to the one before and to the one after, such that anyone who redeems him, relative, foreigner, are both like he himself. So that's why Be'ele says, if in these ways, meaning only these ways, he goes free, but there is another way that he doesn't go free, and even though he's redeemed and remains a slave until the Yovel. That's why I need Be'ele. But we say, if that's how you're reading it, then that really makes sense only according to the Biyoseh HaGalili, that Be'ele is referring to the relatives that are named. All right? If you do it Be'ele, then you go free right away. If not, if it's a non-relative, then you remain. It's difficult to read this according to the Rabbi Akiva. You'd have to add in another Ela, right, before the word Ele. And so we go back to the drawing board. Ela bisvara. The difference between Rabbi Yosef HaGalili and Rabbi Akiva is not based on the pasuk, but rather based on logic. Rabbi Yosef HaGalili sabar. It makes sense that if a foreigner redeems someone, then they remain a slave to that foreigner. Still better to be under a Jew than under a non-Jew. Because if it's to go free, then a foreigner is not going to want to redeem the person, because I'm going to pay money and then they're just going to go free. So if it's a non-relative, then we say, okay, you can keep him as a slave if you redeem him. That way it'll encourage them to redeem. But family member will redeem the person to go free because it's family. So that can be expected. That makes sense. Rabbi Akiva says sometimes family members abuse their obligation to each other. And in this case, it could make sense that if it's a relative, then he remains a slave. Because if when a relative redeems him, he would go free. Then what's that guy going to do? After he goes free, every day he's going to sell himself into slavery again. He gets money every time, and then he'll say, my rich uncle, he'll redeem me. So the rich uncle redeems him. He goes free. What does he do? He goes right back into slavery, makes more money by selling himself, and the uncle will set him free. So because there are people who abuse the obligation that their relatives have towards them, so therefore it doesn't make sense. If the relative redeems him, he remains a slave. Don't sell yourself into slavery again. The above two opinions are only those minority opinions of Rabbi Yosef HaGalili and Rabbi Akiva, but Chachamim actually say that anyone who redeems a slave that's owned by a non-Jew goes free, whether it's a relative or himself or a non-relative. Man Chachamim. Who is this Chachamim? None other than Rabbi that we started, that we discussed right just now. Since he uses the word be'ele for a different reason, to teach that as an Eved that's owned by a non-Jew can only get free by redemption and not by 6 years. So he used the word be'ele as a limiting word for that already. Since he used it already, so he's not going to limit those three phrases instead he's going to say that the middle one, redeeming himself, applies both before and to the one after, both to a relative or to a foreigner redeeming him. So to be is none other than Chachamim, who say that you go free with anyone redeeming him. Now, lastly, but it be Hai ve'asa b'shnat hayovel my avid le. What does it be going to do with that phrase that he leaves in Shnat hayovel? Rabbi Yosef Gili and Rabbi Akiva both dealt with that phrase, right? Where there's someone who goes free right away, and there's another type of redemption who remains a slave and then will go free in the year of the Yovel. But Rabbi says everybody who's redeemed goes free right away. So what is he going to do with this phrase? That he has to wait until Yovel comes. This is referring to that the fact that an Eved Ivri that's owned by a non-Jew goes free during Yovel is only when the non-Jew is under the authority of a Jewish government. There's some kind of Jewish government in Israel, and the non-Jew is under it. Then we can apply that law and force him to free his slaves in the Yovel. So do you say that? Or maybe do you think it refers to a non-Jew not under your authority in Rome or New York or wherever? Well, it's impossible, because what are you going to tell him if it's not under Jewish authority? So no one can go tell a non-Jew and force him to say, oh, you have to free the slave that you bought. So it would be impossible for the Torah to legislate outside of a Jewish jurisdiction. Therefore, it can only be when there's a non-Jew under Jewish authority and buys a Jewish slave. In that case, the Jewish authority can tell him, this is the law of the land, that you must let all of your slaves go free during the year of the Yovel. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.